I think I should say hello to everyone and welcome to today's Renaissance Live, which is on the philosopher René Descartes, who lived between 1596 and 1650. And this session is with and around Stephen Nadler's book, Descartes and the Renewal of Philosophy. So we're in the company of the author, Stephen Nadler, who is professor of philosophy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I'm also delighted to be joined by Guido Giglioni, who is a historian of philosophy from the University of Macerata, and whom I had the privilege to have as a colleague for at least 2 decades at the Warburg Institute. So if we can start in the heart of the subject, there are indeed many intellectual biographies of philosophers, but intellectual biography, but there's not so many lives of philosophers. So my first question to you, Stephen, would be, what is the purpose of writing the life of a philosopher rather than only his intellectual biography? And in the case of Descartes, that is of a dualist who thought his body really separated from his mind, at least in many ways, isn't there some irony to write a history of his body and his body movements rather than of his mind and the movement and progress of his mind?
Well, thank you for a great question to start out with. These were, as we'll all agree, flesh and blood individuals. And I think the question of why write a biography of a philosopher is just as good a question as why write a biography of an artist or a musician, because we can focus on an individual's work, their creativity, but these, as flesh and blood individuals, lived in a certain time in a certain place. And I don't think it's difficult to make the case that to understand why a philosopher says the things he or she says has to, in some way, be a reflection of what their concerns were, their material concerns, not just their philosophical concerns, but their place in society. And especially in Descartes, who moved from France to the Netherlands at a very interesting time in Dutch history and participated in some ways, both for better and for worse, in that history. Descartes was, as you suggested, a proponent of dualism, but he did have a body. And in fact, the dualism, to me, and I think to many scholars of Descartes today, what really matters for Descartes is not the separation of mind and body, but the understanding of the world around us, that is, the bodily world. And the dualism serves a very clear purpose as a way of emptying that physical world of spiritual elements, active spiritual forms, minds throughout nature. There's only human souls. The rest of nature, including the human body, functions like a machine. The philosophers, the biographies of philosophers really have, over the centuries, tended to fall between the literary cracks, because the people who generally write biographies for a broad audience, literary biographies of, let's say, of Dickens, of Woolf, of Shakespeare, and so on, they won't touch philosophers because they think that the philosophy might be a little too difficult or too dense for them. So the people who write biographies don't touch philosophers. And philosophers for a long time tended not to write biographies because it was a disreputable way to spend your time. Philosophers should be doing philosophy and not writing about lives. But I think in the last 2 decades, partly as a response, partly as a part of a great Cambridge series of biographies of philosophers, there's a lot more interest in who these men and women were, and what were the not just philosophical, but also historical, religious, and scientific contexts in which they generated their ideas.
Thank you. Guido.
Well, I can jump here now in this addressing the question of this beautiful book about the biography, but also the philosophical path of René Descartes. And I would like to do it, first of all, by also complimenting the editor of the series, because I found the book very pleasant to read. I mean, the content is is very good. I mean, as I will explain in a minute, but it's also a pleasure to have in your hands a beautiful book, which is properly crafted. And so congratulations to the editor, Francois. Well, the book is beautifully written. I especially liked the idea of focusing on some details of Descartes' life and thought that is probably well known to specialists and scholars in the field, but are not so easily easily remembered. For instance, I was struck by the attention and care with which the author talk about Descartes' daughter. And I think that was important precisely to show that Descartes was a human being, because in general, one of the problems with the biography of Descartes is that he tends to be quite elusive. And the good point of your book is actually you gives us a real portrait, especially of a person who is constantly changing, abode, moving around. And what I found intriguing is this kind of interplay between a very serious need of being secluded and study and work, almost programmatically going away from friends and relatives not to be distracted. And on the other hand, then, a sort of restless looking for a place where you can actually have this room of your own. And I took care in my notes to record all the various places in the Netherlands, because at a certain point, Descartes realizes that the best place to be in order to study in Europe at the moment, after, I would say, the 1620s, is the Netherlands, especially not Italy. And as an Italian, they went back to Italy after about 20 or more years away. I agree with Descartes. You are always distracted in Italy. And this is what Descartes was saying to his friends. Don't go there because you've been there. And the place where to be, if you want to be a philosopher, is the Netherlands. And I really, I like the attention that you paid in recording all the places and the movement, Franeker, Amsterdam, then Leiden, Amsterdam again, 1632, Deventer, and then Amsterdam, Egmond, Binnen, Egmond aan de Earth, Egmond aan Zee, Southport near Haarlem, Leiden, and the Geest, and so on. I thought, I never realized that. I always sort of taking for granted that he liked to be in the Netherlands and maybe was near Amsterdam or near The Hague, and that's it. Instead, it's very interesting. It's fascinating to see how he was moving around. So going back also to the point made by Francois, yes, it's a question of a mind carried by the body. Both the mind and the body apparently were restless. I like the idea of structuring the narrative according to, at least this is the way I read the book, according to important decades in Descartes' life, but also in European life, the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s of the 17th centuries. The 20s is, I realized reading your book how the 20s were very important for the intellectual history in general of Europe. It was the beginning of a long war, but was also a sort of explosion of talents and minds working on the possible way of organizing knowledge through a method. Everyone was looking for a method, and Descartes, whatever was that scientia penitus nova, this completely new science that he talks about in this period, the scientia nova penitus is in a letter to Beckmann of 1619. Whatever was this new view of science, definitely Descartes, who is in a company of many other people, among whom Bacon, because 1620 is the year where the Novum Organum was published. And then the 30th, in your narrative, is fascinating to see how the Descartes was not struggling, was changing, sort of, he was scaling back and forth the preeminence to give to his physics or metaphysics, whether the world or whether the self, the mind. And he was doing this exercise of showing these different parts of his growing system according to what was happening in the world and according to the varying circumstances. And one of these very important circumstances at the time was certainly the condemnation of Galilei, which Descartes took very seriously. And so he reorganized his publishing strategy and decided not to go with the Le Monde, this kind of book that was supposed to be his appearance on the theater of contemporary culture with a systematic account of the world, and instead he decided to collect a few essays premised by the famous Discours de la Méthode. And when we teach in the classroom this classic of French thinking, but also French language, Le Discours de la Méthode, we always tend not to forget, but it's very difficult, I find, dealing with students, to show them that in fact there was just a sort of introductory preface to important essays of physics. But definitely that introduction became so powerful, important. I would say, for what you're arguing in the book, that there was constantly this shifting of planes about metaphysics and physics, physics and metaphysics, depending on the circumstances. And finally, the 40s. Descartes is now a star, a very important philosopher, and he wants to become a university philosopher. So he's thinking of a textbook. And I like the sentence you report in your refer in your account in a letter to Huygens. Descartes is saying that he wants Le Monde to speak in Latin. Le Monde to speak in Latin. I found this very interesting. First of all, because we have the awareness of the author that is a bilingual author who knows that it's important to write in French and also to write in Latin, depending again on circumstances and audiences. But I like the idea of summarizing this period of his life, the 40s, as this attempt to provide an international systematic account of his philosophy. I would like to conclude my presentation. I have many other. I read full of papers, but I don't want really to bore people with too many too many information. And I really suggest, advise people to read the book if they want to have a concise but then very effective account of the philosopher. I would like to conclude talking about a point that it's very. 2 points, actually, 2 points. The one is philosophical, and we had already the opportunity briefly to discuss this. And and about the connection between consciousness, the self, and God. And in your account, I once again found how important is in Descartes' a crucial argument of the demonstration of the indubitable existence of the thinking subject, how important is the link with God. And I think the way you discuss this, and I want to compliment you about this because it's a very difficult point, and you manage in a chapter to give a clear account of this, how really the link between human mind, extension, and God is in a way connected to this idea of existence as thinking subjectivity, j'existe, how strong and full of energy is actually this j'existe. And when the contemporary accuse him to use the ergo, no, therefore, I think, therefore I exist, as a sort of disguised syllogism of the old scholasticism. In fact, here we have something genuinely different. Is the fact that to think and exist are one thing, and is the ability to have idea, or maybe to people be possessed by ideas that are so clear, so distinct, that we actually see the truth. And in this ability to have ideas, the predominant ideas is precisely the idea of perfection and infinite. And this idea is God. And I found that the way you connect this point is very clear. And finally, my last point has to do with modern philosophy, progressive philosophy. You're using more than once this adjective, and I think it's an important point to decide why at a certain point we talk about renewal of philosophy, as you do in your book. In what ways Descartes is the father of progressive modern philosophy, or one of the parents, as you say at the end of the book, and whether means that at the time we can maybe talk of regressive tendency, more generally. What is your view of modern philosophy, and if there is something actually rather distinctive compared to the Renaissance or the Middle Ages or before, that makes this period different? And finally, the point that this book, in fact, is a Renaissance life. In what way Descartes can be considered a Renaissance man, and not rather an enlightened man, or whether Renaissance and Enlightenment are connected or are different. Sorry about this ending, very tense, but it's because of the pleasure I had reading your book. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Guido. Let me start with a few brief remarks about the early part of what you said. First of all, Descartes' change of residencies in the Netherlands, and in fact, the initial move to the Netherlands in the first place. I think this is one of the really interesting questions around Descartes' life, of why the move from France to the Netherlands. On the one hand, who doesn't love the Netherlands? And especially, as Descartes says, if you're seeking to immerse yourself in a world where people really, as he says, mind their own business. And does he simply want to be left alone? or is he fleeing something in France? I think it's a combination of both. I don't think there's a simple answer to this question. What he may have been trying to leave in France was not just the interruptions by friends and family, and also the engagement with family business. He probably had relatives saying, will you stop playing around with philosophy and pursue this legal career that you trained for? But also, and this may also speak to why he didn't end up in Italy or didn't stay there for very long, he may have wanted no longer to be in a country that was dominantly Catholic. And in the Netherlands, you were further away from the censorship of ecclesiastic authorities in the French Catholic Church. On the other hand, the Netherlands was both a blessing and a curse for Descartes, because he may have escaped Catholic opprobrium, at least from the Dutch authorities, but what he found there was a pretty severe opprobrium coming from the Dutch Reformed Church. And one of the nasty extended episodes of Descartes' life was the trouble he found from Dutch Reformed clerics, people like Gijsbert, Fuchs, and others. So yes, on the one hand, he found in the Netherlands, the Dutch Republic, the peace and quiet he sought to pursue his studies, but the other time he also found a hornet's nest of trouble. Some of it not of his own making, but trouble nonetheless. He was not, and I try to portray this in the book, he was not some misanthropic recluse, as people like to sometimes describe him as being. He was sociable, but on his own terms. There were people who he enjoyed spending time with. There are people whose company he sought both for pleasure, but also for business and research purposes. I think one of the more interesting episodes in his life concerns his relationship with these Catholic priests in Haarlem, Augustine Blumart and Albert Bahn. They met together frequently in the evening to talk about music, to play music. And so you get a nice insight into Descartes as a sociable person. All right, now let me turn to some of the questions you raised. First, what you called the philosophical question, and you raised the issue of the relationship between consciousness and the alleged, the so-called discovery of the self on the one hand, and God. And this raises the question about the role that God plays in Descartes' philosophy. I think it's clear that Descartes does not need God for what you described as the indubitable existence of the thinking subject. The existence, my own existence as a thinking subject, or the meditator's existence as a thinking subject, does not require God. That's something that is absolutely indubitably certain before Descartes even knows that God exists. The question is, what else can I know? I can know that I exist, and I can know a lot of things about myself well before I know anything about God. I can know that I'm a thinking, not just that I exist, but I exist as a thinking thing. And as a thinking thing, I'm absolutely indubitably certain that I have these ideas, these thoughts. And among these thoughts is the thought about God. But again, the question is, what else can I know? Is there anything beyond this world of my ideas? And that's where, in the meditations, he needs to bring in God. One of the perennial questions about Descartes is whether this use of God is a last-ditch effort, a deus ex machina, in order to simply get himself out of this epistemological dilemma. The way in which Descartes has been read for so long, I think, and it'll be interesting to hear what some of the other scholars who are here today think, the emphasis has been way too long on the meditations. For Descartes, the meditations were a one-off exercise. Semel in vita, he says, once in one's life. One has to go through this exercise and take care of any skeptical doubts about whether true knowledge, scientific knowledge, is possible. Having done that, let's get on to the really interesting and important work, which is understanding the world, pursuing scientific explanations of phenomena in clear and perspicuous terms, in terms of matter and motion and the laws of nature, that will explain why things happen as they do. So here, for example, you see both his accounts of the vortices of the heavens and magnetism. Once Descartes has gone through the exercise of the meditations, and he does provide us a summary of that in the first part of the Principles of Philosophy, now we can get on to the important business. In other words, we shouldn't think that we really know Descartes if all we know is the meditations. Descartes was first and foremost a scientist. And what the meditations does is lay out the epistemological foundations for pursuing science. That is, the nature of clear and distinct ideas, the justification of my rational faculties, and the metaphysical foundations, which most importantly consists in the distinction of mind and body. Once we have this dualist distinction of mind and body, and there's nothing really that new about Descartes' dualism. That dualism was there in Plato. It was there in St. Paul's letter to the Romans. Dualism is nothing new. What's new is the way in which Descartes has taken features of the physical world, that is, features traditionally attributed to the physical world, active powers, forces that seem to be operating as little minds and bodies, removed them from the physical world. And with this strong divide between the mental and the physical, once the physical world has been depleted of mentalistic items, then the metaphysical foundations for Cartesian science have been laid, and we can go about providing mechanistic explanations for phenomena, for natural phenomena. If you were to ask me what's modern, well, you did ask me what's modern about Descartes, what is the renewal of philosophy? That's where I think it is. It's not so much in the dualism. What makes Descartes, I think, most innovative and most important for the history of philosophy is not the epistemology, but the science, the mechanistic picture of the world. And of course, he was not the only one proposing this new way of looking at nature. Galileo, Hobbes, and then after him, Gassendi. There were many alternate mechanistic pictures, Boyle, Locke, and so on. So to think that Descartes was the father of modern philosophy, I think, is to give too much credit to one person. I think rather we should think of him as part of a family of thinkers, maybe all parents, a family of thinkers who are contributing to this new way of imagining not just what the nature of the world is, but how to go about investigating it. Bacon, your favorite, I think should be included in this as well, although I think there are significant differences between Bacon and Descartes. So the reason why I called the book The Renewal of Philosophy is because I don't think that Descartes creates modern philosophy. I don't think he's the father of modern philosophy. I don't think he is the absolute starting point of anything new, but rather contributes to a new way of thinking about what the task of philosophy is and how philosophy should go about pursuing that task. Is he a member of the Enlightenment? Is he a member of the Renaissance? Well, these are artificial historiographical distinctions. There's not a single point at which the Renaissance ends and the Enlightenment begins. I have a great deal of respect for Jonathan Israel's work on the Enlightenment, but to see it all coming down to a single point, a single thinker or a single idea or a single book. And if you were to ask me, okay, granted all that, is there not some really important book that sets philosophy in this renewed direction? I would say, yeah, we can point to Descartes, but I wouldn't point to the Meditations. I would point to Le Monde or his the Treatise on Man, Traité de l'Homme. This is where Descartes' project really appears in its concrete form, and I think are undervalued contributions to the rise of this new way of doing philosophy.
Thank you.
So that was a lot in response. We can pick in there or move on as you wish.
Yes, thank you.
Well, I can jump in at this stage because, as Guido was saying, God is essential for Descartes' philosophy, but as you highlight in your book, he got into a big controversy in Utrecht because some Utrecht academics thought that his philosophy was the royal road to atheism. How do you separate both sides?
Well, I'm not going to take the word of Descartes' opponents for what counts as atheism or what counts as sincere piety. As you know, the word atheist is a very equivocal one, and especially in this period. It simply means that somebody has religious views that don't jibe with my own. And I'll call, in a way, the word atheist in the 17th century was used very much in the way in which communist was used in the United States in the 1950s and 1960s and 70s and 80s and 90s and 2000s and so on. It's really a meaningless word that you use to denigrate your intellectual or political opponents. Was Descartes an atheist? I don't think so, and especially not in the sense in which we now understand the term. And I know that there's a great deal of disagreement between me and some of the other people who are here today. I think Spinoza, for example, is plausibly an atheist in that sense, but not Descartes. But we still should ask the question of how sincere, not how sincere are Descartes' religious beliefs. I don't think we really have any reason to doubt those, but rather how sincere is he in his use of God in his philosophical writings? In the Meditations, you have God's role as the validator of my clear and distinct ideas, as the validator of my rational faculty, such that I have no reason to trust my rational faculties, and perhaps good reasons not to trust my rational faculties, until I know with absolute certainty that these rational faculties were given to me by an omnipotent, omniscient, wise, just, non-deceiving God. And once I know that, then I can know that when I use these faculties properly, they will bring me to the truth. The other significant moment where God makes its appearance is in the Principles of Philosophy and other writings, where Descartes explains the origin of motion and of the laws of motion. And here I think we need to take seriously the role that God plays, the causal role, not the epistemic role, but the causal role that God is supposed to play. So much so that I think it's legitimate to ask whether without God, Descartes' physics can possibly succeed. It's one thing to ask whether the epistemology can succeed without God, but once you've reduced matter to mere extension, you have a problem with explaining the dynamic behaviors and properties of bodies. This is something that Descartes' followers, such as Malebranche, saw, that once you remove Aristotelian type forms and powers and forces from physical bodies, how do you account for motion, elasticity, and other properties that bodies display that can be captured by dynamic, in dynamic terms? Without God, there's no in Descartes' universe, without God, there's no motion. And without God constantly moving bodies around, you don't have the laws of motion. You don't have bodies behaving in characteristic ways. So I think it's a really good question of whether Descartes realizes that the only way to save his physics, just as the only way to save his epistemology, is to bring in God, or is this a sincerely presented foundation, not just faute de mieux, but absolutely essential to Cartesian physics. The Cartesian occasionalists who followed him, Laforge, Cordemois, and Malebranche, I think took Descartes in a direction. The occasionalists believe that finite creatures, whether bodies or minds, have no real causal powers of their own. Only God has causal powers. And so when a body is moving, God is moving that body. When I will to raise my arm, my volition, my mind doesn't cause my arm to rise, but the arm does. And I think one of the fascinating questions of this period is, to what extent do these occasionalists like Malebranche, Laforge, Cordemois, Hoylings, and others, are they simply bringing out what's latent in Descartes' philosophy, or are they supplementing it in a way that they found necessary in order to save it? Are they correcting Descartes, or are they simply finishing what Descartes started?
Yes, this is very interesting, actually, this point. Maybe thinking of God in the sense of the infinite, and something like infinite overpowerful, can be a way almost secularizing the idea of God. I think Descartes is sometimes also talking in theological terms. He knew very well those aspects, but maybe looking at the aspect of God as infinite power can be a way of almost seeing how close a certain reading of Descartes could also be to Spinoza, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because Spinoza, I think, is saying, okay, look, I mean, Descartes' God is a very sparely conceptualized God. It doesn't seem to be a God, and this is perhaps what most annoyed his religious critics in the time. It's not a God you would pray to or put your hopes in or worship. He does allow God to be a providential deity, because he is willing to concede at times that we can bring in teleological considerations, for example, the connection between emotions in the body and sensations that benefit us. And God has a plan, and God is providential in that sense. But Descartes' God is not a God that you would seek solace or comfort in. And so I think you're absolutely right. Spinoza comes along and says, well, look, okay, what we mean by God is an infinite, eternal, powerful substance. Now, let me show you, Spinoza is saying, let me show you that if that's what you believe in God, here's where you end up. That God is nature, and all there is nature. There's no transcendent, providential, anthropomorphic deity.
Yeah. There is if I have a little bit of time, there is another aspect I liked of your book, the way you talk about Descartes' control of the publishing events in his life. He was very concerned with publisher or circulating manuscripts, and in particular, I found very interesting the way you recount the story of the second edition of the Meditations, when he wants to have a diffusion of his book in the Netherlands, and he knows that it's important to have there's all kind of technical aspects of the printing trade and business, like the privilege, l'approbation, and the fact that the first edition published in France by, I think, Michel Solly, right? He the copyright and the sort of financial protection of the book was limited to France. And so the book was exposed to all sorts of acts of piracy, typographical printing piracy, and he was very concerned about this, and he wanted to have someone trusted in the Netherlands, but also he knew very well of the importance that it's not a question of privilege, but also appropriation, and the fact that you also have to have the support and the Neil Hobstadt from the theological faculty. And if I understood correctly, approbation was of a theological nature. And so I learned a lot in this kind of technical domain, and I think it's interesting to see that a literary biography is not just the story of an author, but also very often is a story of the books he produced and how these books have a life of their own. And the life of the Meditaciones, the Prima Filosofia, are particularly interesting, also because you were saying Descartes is not a a misanthrope. Not at all. He wanted to have a debate. So he wanted to have some objection. He wanted to reply to the objection, which is a very modern way of replicating the format of the question, the dialogue in the age of the printing press. And in order to do so, he has to be very savvy with all this question. There has to be with the has to do more with the printing trade and commerce.
Yeah, so then in the Netherlands, there was no central body providing approbation the way you might seek the approbation of the doctors of the Sorbonne in France. And so publication was freer in the Netherlands. In fact, the Netherlands had a great reputation in this period of producing books that couldn't possibly have been produced elsewhere. I mean, the things coming off the presses, Descartes published with Elsevier, but if you think of other even radical publishers like Jan Riewerts in Amsterdam, things were coming off Dutch presses, philosophical treatises, scientific treatises, literary works, erotic works. It was much freer in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, than it was anywhere else. So there was, first of all, Descartes' desire to exercise some kind of editorial control and distribution control. At the same time, he did want the approbation. He wanted to see his works adopted in the schools, colleges, and university faculties. And so you have his keeping in touch with the Jesuit fathers in France, trying to see his works adopted by Dutch universities. This, of course, is where trouble begins.
Yes.
And some of his disciples, in their attempts to introduce Cartesian philosophy into their courses in medicine and physics and philosophy, that's the source of a lot of the trouble that Descartes faced, because the universities in the Netherlands were very, very resistant to this. And what's interesting is that the real trouble for Descartes begins in the Netherlands much earlier than it begins in France. Formal censures in France don't come until decades after all the troubles in the Netherlands. The objections and Descartes' desire to carry on a kind of dialogue with objectors. I'm always amused at both his desire to have his ideas tested by receiving objections, and his very stubborn, even impolite responses to objections. I mean, I think, what was he expecting? You send this to Hobbes. Why didn't Hobbes agree with everything I said? What was wrong? I'll send it to Gassendi. Well, that didn't turn out well. It ended up with name calling. And I think the only set of objections Descartes has anything positive to say are the fourth set of objections from Arnauld. Perhaps because Arnauld, as a new member of the Sorbonne, would be the kind of individual that Descartes would like to see join his camp, which Arnauld eventually does. So he has a very funny ambivalence about objections. Yeah, bring it on, but how dare you?
No, I found again this kind of interplay of seclusion and openness,
Yeah.
which seems to be a characteristic feature of his life.
Yeah, tell me how much you love me. That's what he wants to hear. But at the same time, those are the objections to meditations. The correspondence, the much broader correspondence, I think this is a really rich and informative overview, both of the kinds of debates that Descartes valued, but also his openness to sincere philosophical dialogue with others. I think the objections to the meditations are not Descartes at his finest, but put in the broader context of his correspondence, you can see that he shared, I think, one of the defining features of what we still call the scientific revolution, even though I think it's a misnomer. And namely, that is, science is a social enterprise. It's not a bunch of isolated individuals doing a priori investigations into the natures of things, but it's a social enterprise that requires collaboration, resistance, objections, critiques. Descartes was not one to change his mind easily, but you get the sense from his correspondence with certain individuals that he valued their input.
Isn't Descartes' reaction a proportion of his enormous ambition to replace Aristotle in education? It's really wanting to operate a revolution and put oneself at the center of things, isn't it?
It is. I'm not sure I would take the word revolution here, because I wouldn't want to say that Descartes was a revolutionary. But yes, I think it was a way to, and I'll use a very loaded term, move the paradigm. And what Descartes did succeed in doing, more so, I think, than other thinkers of his cohort, like Hobbes or Gassendi, was to create or usher in a new dominant paradigm for philosophy and science for the rest of the century. Even Leibniz has to deal with Cartesianism. It cannot be ignored. I think that's Descartes' real achievement here. Not dualism, not effecting some kind of, well, you know, to speak of paradigms recalls revolutions, because these are scientific revolutions, but the way in which he redefined the terms in which scientific explanations are to be framed, and the way in which one is to go about framing those explanations with metaphysical foundations. I think those are Descartes' real contributions, whether we want to call it the Renaissance or the Enlightenment or the scientific revolution. That's sort of immaterial. But I think there's also a great deal of continuity here, and that's why I'm hesitant to use the word revolution. Descartes maybe disingenuously says he's not saying anything that the Aristotelians didn't say, but despite his attempt to co-opt old vocabulary, there really is, I think, a significant change going on here, substantive change in what science is doing and how it does it.
Guido, you want to continue? I certainly have another question.
I was when Stephen was talking about the correspondence and the way he reacted to some of the objectors and the correspondence. I certainly agree that he wrote and had a correspondence with many people. I mean, you can study Descartes looking at the many volumes of letters he exchanged with many people in Europe. Actually, you can see how sometimes very interesting remarks are in these letters, and you use the letters a lot. I think it's a good way also to deal with the biography of a person. But one case in particular, you noticed that, is the objection about the relationship between the mind and body, Hobbes and Gassendi. He was very annoyed, but then there is this correspondence with the Princess Elizabeth, the daughter of the famous Queen and Elizabeth and Frederick, right?
Yeah, Frederick of Bohemia.
The winter king and queen. And actually, I'd always found that very interesting story. Now the role of Elizabeth has been studied, and rightly so. But there was something there, and definitely, I think that one of the most fascinating works by Descartes is Les Passions de l'âme. I think that was, yes, maybe occasioned by the exchange with Elizabeth. Maybe it's not something he planned, but I think it's an important contribution that we tend to forget sometime now, especially when we talk about Descartes as a possible father or spurious father of neuroscience. I tend to see, as we discussed earlier, a continuity between Descartes and neuroscience. Some neuroscientists don't accept this. Damasio famously says that there is a glaring mistake in the approach by Descartes. But I would suggest that maybe studying the Passion de l'âme, especially in this context, can be very important. Also, also with respect to the question of God, because God is not there, although when he talks about particular states of mind related to the will, there are hints, states of contemplation. They are almost divinely determined. But in general, I mean, the fact that we have sense perception, the fact that we are connected to the world in the way we are, the fact that we respond, we have these reactions, has been divinely set through a sort of code that the God established, that is a code that is, I would say, almost digital and non-analogical, because like language and letter and the fact that there are some sounds, some signs that have no connection natural with the thing that they design, and yet they cause in our mind certain reactions, certain images. So it's the same way, God created the world, created being in such a way that we react to this according to a code. Let's call it nature, because nature is this code created by God. So that we are actually connected to reality, and this connection that we have with reality, this perception of reality, is precisely our emotions. We feel the world, for Descartes, I would say. If you read the last work, you have this kind of more affective, emotional Descartes, precisely because emotions are the way in which we feel reality, and we can orient ourselves reality. We can survive. They have an almost utilitarian, pragmatic functions, and so I would say that whether Hobbes and Gassendi created a kind of reaction that what they want them from me, what they want they from me, Elizabeth probably sort of activated different kind of reflections in Descartes. You said earlier Descartes was very kind of sometimes not easy to change with respect to his idea, but in some other cases, and in this case, it seems that there was actually an interesting evolution from the correspondence with Elizabeth.
Yeah, one of the more puzzling statements from Descartes, I find more puzzling, is in his response to the idea that mind and body can't interact because there's a problem here of dualism. And he says in this letter, the only reason why you're having trouble understanding this is because you're assuming that two things that are so radically different cannot causally interact. I think he takes the objection a little bit more seriously from Elizabeth, although it doesn't resolve it, when he tells her that you shouldn't try to understand the mind-body relationship in conceptual terms drawn from the body, nor in conceptual terms drawn from the mind, but it's evident in experience that there is this interaction, but he doesn't quite have the tools to explain the mechanism behind that. I think Gassendi, he gets a bum rap for one thing. He says to Descartes, I want you to give me an explanation of the mind like you would give me an explanation of wine. That is how the body, the chemical makeup of wine and how it has its effects.
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting, yes.
It's a very interesting exchange. Yeah. And Gassendi, I think, unfairly is accused of making a category mistake here, that, well, no, that's exactly what we can't do. we can't give a mechanistic explanation of the mind and its relationship to the body, because the mind is not a body and so is not subject to mechanistic terms. But I think what Gassendi is asking for is not for a literally mechanistic explanation of the mind, but rather an explanation of the mind that does the same work for mental states that corpuscular explanations do for the states of bodies. In other words, give me as clear an account of how the mind operates as you can give me of how wine or some other body operates. And so I think there's a lost opportunity there. But by that point, personal relations between Descartes and Gassendi have sunk so low, there was no way this was going to be fruitful. The other disappointment, I mean, we should be grateful to Elizabeth, both for her really insightful questions for Descartes, not just on mind-body relations, but on the nature of the emotions, and especially as she presses him for advice on how to deal with her personal traumas. We get elicited from Descartes the closest thing we really have to a moral philosophy, and his comments on virtue, both as they appear in that correspondence and in the Passion de l'âme. It's just too bad that Descartes never really completed the principles of philosophy. It ends with part 4, which is essentially the physics, particular explanations in physics. But we know that his ultimate intention was to compose at least one and perhaps 2 other parts. One part which would be an investigation of the soul itself, and then another part which would be an investigation of the relationship between the soul and the body. And what we really have from Descartes on that second point really just is the Passion de l'âme. It would take Laforge in 1660, Clercellier and Laforge, with the publication of Descartes' Treatise on Man in 1664, to provide us with something like that 5th part, that is the human body without a soul. And then Laforge himself in 1666, his Traité de l'Esprit de l'âme, to give us that other part on the nature of the mind or soul and its interaction relationship with the body. So, why Descartes never finished the principles in the ways in which he had planned, perhaps because he lost so much time fighting against the authorities of the Dutch Reformed Church, or maybe he realized that the Treatise on Man, which he then came back to and revised into the description of the human body, might have sufficed for those purposes. But I'll defer to others who might have interesting views on that question.
Actually, it might be time to open the panel to the audience for question and discussion. But you were about to say something, Guido, so maybe a last point, and then we open to the panel. Tell me.
No. I was scratching my ear.
Okay. Okay. Well, so I invite you to put your question to both Stephen and Guido. You can use the raise hand option on the bottom right of your screen, and then I will ask you to unmute yourself, or you can send me a question through the chat, and then I'll put it to our guest. In the meantime, as you prepare your question, well, I have a question for you, Stephen, to which you've partly answered during this conversation, and namely that in the 20th century, many artists, philosophers, and neuroscientists have completely dismissed dualism or rejected dualism. So in which way is Descartes the father of modern philosophy, and is modern philosophy to be distinguished from a more contemporary current, or perhaps currents that could be described as a non-dualist or anti-dualist? But I think that you can both answer this question, and I'm listening to you.
So I think I would answer it in 2 ways. First of all, to reject the dualism there are 2 ways you can do that. One is to revert to Aristotelian scholasticism and reintroduce active forms into matter, in a way not that different from what Leibniz did. But the other way to reject dualism is to basically cut off that part of Descartes' philosophical project, but maintain the scientific program. And so in that sense, this would be my first answer. Descartes is the father, he's one of the parents of modern science, because he recognizes that explanations of natural phenomena cannot appeal to intentional soul-like elements in nature. It has to be framed solely in terms of matter and motion. And that really just is the same picture of physics that we today. I mean, there's a much more complicated picture of what matter is. The second sense in which I would say that Descartes represents the beginning of modern philosophy is not so much with respect to what science is, but to what philosophy is. So many of the problems, and I think this is especially true in the Anglo-American philosophical world, but as well, I think in the continental European philosophical world. What are the problems of philosophy today? The problems of epistemology are dealing with skepticism, understanding the difference between knowledge and belief, understanding the relationship between evidence, justification, and truth. These are problems that Descartes wrestled with, perhaps in the clearest possible way after Plato did. Secondly, problems of the relationship between metaphysics and physics. We live in a post-Newtonian world where science doesn't, at least in theory, doesn't require metaphysical foundations. But the metaphysical problems that we deal with in philosophy, questions of personal identity, questions of the nature of human nature, and if you're interested in the soul, questions about the nature of the soul. Descartes really set the agenda for much of philosophizing. No matter how much we depart from Descartes' answers, I think a lot of the questions are there in Descartes in a especially clear and influential way.
Okay, so you're really answering to another question I had in my mind, that is whether Descartes' concept of truth is still relevant, because your answer is that it's not about the concept of truth, it's about the questions that Descartes asked, which are relevant. Would you agree with that characterization?
I would say, well, I don't think that we've here we get to an issue about the place of philosophy in the humanities more generally. We may reject in philosophy, we may reject Descartes' answers to these questions and say, well, they are not true. But I think what distinguishes philosophers, and here I'll take it upon myself to speak for the field of philosophy, we still believe in truth, and we still believe that there are certain truths in philosophical truths about belief, about epistemological truths, moral, ethical truths. We're still seeking moral foundations. You can be a Kantian, you can be a utilitarian, you can be a virtue theorist. But I think in the philosophical enterprise, we're still very much interested in what is true. And we do believe, and maybe not everybody, but a lot of us still believe that there are truths to be attained of a philosophical nature. Is there such a thing as free will, for example? And I think this distinguishes philosophy from a lot of other disciplines in the humanities, which seem to have abandoned not just any interest in truth, but the whole notion that there is such a thing as objective and absolute truth, which is, to my mind, a very dangerous position these days, where we're willing to allow, as some Republican politicians in our country have insisted, that there are alternate versions of the truth. This is where we end up. Well, this is very frightening.
Thank you both, Guido and Stephen, and also Daniel, for your quality intervention, and wish you a nice evening and a pleasant weekend. And this series will continue, but this is the last session of this academic year, and we'll start again this coming November with Abby Warburg. So thank you again.
Very nice.
Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.
Very good night to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye.